thank you to the forces that be that allowed us to come and do death camp, as some of our participants called it. We're having it seems like a very, when I tell people what I'm working on, often the reaction is, oh, that's kind of morbid, they don't want to hear anything else. But actually, there's a way in which I think it's not too surprising that thinking about, talking about death is life-affirming, and there is also space for humor, right? This is something that that's how we deal with things, and that's almost, I don't know if it's a cultural universal, but it's certainly something I'm sure you all could tell me gallows humor jokes in the reception if you'd like. I'd like to hear them. I'm collecting them. Just to talk very generally about how this came to be, or what we're doing, I think, and then I'm going to give a really quick mini history of the study of death, at least from the disciplines that I know best. But just to say that death cultures, I think I don't remember what we ended up with in the proposal, but if I think about it, it'd be more accurate to have the plural there, because there are multiple death cultures, but we're really interested in what's happening now in a contemporary period, because there are a lot of practices that are new practices that are emerging and things are changing very rapidly. There are also ones that are part of a globalized society in which rites and rituals may not be bounded by space or by national boundaries. Things are hopping around, maybe due to capitalism, due to the internet for sure, and the mobility that plane travel and car travel allows us. There's also new social and religious movements that are developing and spreading new approaches to death, or even ways to transcend death. So, as a group, I think we're interested in some very common, we share a lot of interests, even though we're interdisciplinary, quite diverse. Historians, a philosopher, media studies, religious studies from different disciplinary groundings, anthropology. We probably dominate a little bit too much, the frustration of some of our other folks, but that is the big umbrella for SAR as well. Filmmaking, a couple of filmmakers in the group, including myself, and archaeology. And if it seems strange that I'm focusing on the 21st century, just as a little side note, one of the new social movements within academia is archaeology of the contemporary. So to take archaeological concerns, questions, and methods with human and material relationships, and what happens if we take an archaeological lens to contemporary life. And it really does produce a different kind of perspective than an ethnographer or historian would take. But as a group, we're interested in social movements that reconceive death, or whose members promote what they think might be a good death. So there's a lot of talk about good death and bad death in a lot of societies, but people have agendas of trying to perhaps may have more control and agency over defining a good death, which also means having a good life. They're inexorable. We're interested in bodies, both of the deceased and of those who care for them. We're interested in ways that technology and different forms of media are affecting how we acknowledge death and how we mourn. And we're interested in how people think about death and what might happen or not happen afterwards. And in what sorts of relationships are possible in a religiously pluralistic, or increasingly, some would say, secular society, the relationships between the living and the dead. So those are some of our common concerns. We are, after myself and Tamara go around, we are going to have the seminar participants just say very briefly what their topic is that we've been discussing in this 5-day seminar. So I'll do that for myself right now. So my current project has a filmmaking component. I'm working with a filmmaker to interview Americans who are involved in new death practices, but I'm specifically interested in what's happening to the disposition, as we call it, of the body, what happens to the dead body, what people are doing with it, and why it's now okay for a lot of people not only to give up on the traditional American funeral of viewing the embalmed corpse and doing the cemetery vault and the fancy casket, etc., but also I'm seeing, and many other people are too, an increasing comfort with the idea of natural decomposition. Green burial is probably a movement you've heard of. But also what people are doing with cremated remains. They're not just scattering them, they're making them into new kinds of objects that allow them to have a continuous relationship with the dead as forms of memorials. So those are the things that both in the filmmaking and as I'm writing, they're parallel. But the filmmaking would be for a general audience, and then for my scholarly interlocutors, the book will be for them. But stay tuned, filmmaking is, I'm learning a lot. I actually hesitate to call myself a filmmaker. I'm trailing along with the filmmaker and learning as I go along. So the very general background I'm about to provide reflects my own bias and training in Americanist history. I also have a joint degree in history and anthropology and in anthropology. But it at least shares a borderland with some of the other scholars in the room to give you an idea of what we're up to and what our kind of common touchstones are. So Western scholars have periodically made death a topic of study, but it's fluctuated in fashion over time. And to zero in on anthropology and archaeology, SARs, a little special. History, anyway, even though I know you're expanding and inviting other disciplines in now very productively. But comparative religion was a core concern in early anthropology before World War II. And just about every holistic ethnography where you read it and find everything you ever want to know about culture X usually had a section on different rites of what Arnold van Gennep called rites of passage, birth, death, marriage, often puberty rites. But death and funeral rites were a very important part of that suite of what we need to understand a culture. You have to understand their forms of death and death ritual. So it was there very centrally in early anthropology. And also, a very important thinker for this, and he had a revival in the 60s, and I think he's now having another revival, at least I'm finding him very important, is a guy, in English he gets translated as Robert Hertz, but he was actually French and a student of Émile Durkheim, so I presume that he pronounced his name Robert Hertz. But he tragically died at the age of 34 in battle in World War I think in battle, certainly in action. And ironically or not ironically, right before he died, he published a very important piece theorizing death in different societies. And from a grand Durkheimian point of view, meaning a universal kind of explanation that might work in most, if not all, societies. And he argued that societies on some level perceive themselves to be immortal, that although the individual members of the society will pass on, the society itself continues, and that the members of society never in themselves may not actually die, but that the relative relationship to living is what changes, and they become dead members of the society, most often in the form of ancestors, but also ghosts, gods, sometimes spirits, living in a parallel world. These are all the possibilities. Psychologically, he had a psychological component to his argument too, which is really interesting and very precocious, actually. In some ways, he was the first one to theorize attachment theory, but actually it was from the reverse, that how we have to detach at death in a very gradual process, and that there are stages of grief. He anticipated Kubler-Ross, which is very popular, the 5 stages of grief. She's a psychologist who published this. If you don't know this, if people talk about the 5 stages of grief, it comes from her work, and I think her mother's work, actually, in the 1960s. But he anticipated this as well through comparatively studying different cultures. But interesting for my work, he tied this to the stages of decay of the body. And that as people engaged with the corpse in different rituals at different times post-mortem, it allowed them to detach gradually from that person. And it was also a marker of how that person was moving. First of all, that physical death and social death were not the same thing, that physical death might be very sudden, but social death could be gradual, and that perhaps never ever happen if they become a remembered ancestor. So, to jump back to early archaeologists, when they weren't excavating ruins, they were excavating, some would say raiding, tombs. to understand structure and belief systems of past societies. Grave goods and the way the body was prepared often gave them much more information than looking at the foundations of houses and the occasional trash pits. So mortuary archaeology has been a very important part of the discipline, not uncontroversially, however. In the 1960s, anthropology developed a very strong interest in ritual and symbolism that helped elaborate our understandings of what was happening with the death ritual. And there's still a lot of theory that we've been invoking in the seminar that comes from this period. Not uncritically, but it's still living with us. And as both subfields matured, archaeology and anthropology, studies generally became more specialized, and it became more the purview of mortuary archaeologists or ethnographers who were struck by case studies that, that to them seemed particularly exotic and interesting to think with. But simultaneously in the 1960s, psychologists were becoming more interested in grief and mourning, while the very important French cultural historian Philippe Arié was finishing up and publishing this massive tome on funerary practices in the West, by which he really meant Western Europe, in which he tracked essentially 5 different dominant death cultures that had succeeded one another from the early Middle Ages until the middle of the 20th century. And so maybe to him, Paul owed the idea that a death culture is something that's not so much defined by national boundaries and not necessarily by religion either, but by a shared sets of beliefs and values and practices that it can articulate with those other boundaries and cultural groupings in different ways. Still, towards the end of his life, he was invited to talk in the US, and he did write an important article in which he said that in the US, Americans are the most extreme example of the last stage of death, which he called the medicalization of death, or the sequestering, the hiding of death. And he has this famous statement that Americans are the most death-denying culture of all. And that's been something that's, I think people have taken as a truism up until the present moment. And this was a sentiment that was also expressed famously by the journalist Jessica Mitford. How many people are familiar with Jessica Mitford? I always like to do this, yeah. Some people are, but you probably are familiar with her ideas. She wrote this book in 1963 called The American Way of Death. And if you don't know the book itself, it's had profound effects upon the way Americans talk about death and the options they now choose for themselves and their loved ones. It was a muckraking critique of the American funeral industry. No holds barred. She did not hold back. So in a nutshell, she said that the American funeral industry was run by a bunch of swindlers who had manipulated people who were in a heightened, vulnerable emotional state and conned them into outrageously expensive and unnecessary things like embalming, a fancy casket, a rite in a hearse, a cement-lined vault, and a customized monument in the cemetery. And her critique helped launch a national conversation about death in the US that was so pervasive and quick, actually. She had good connections, but there was a lot of publicity right away, such that she actually had an effect on the JFK funeral. Robert F. Kennedy and Jackie Onassis, or later Onassis, Jackie Kennedy, had a lot of conversations about what to do about the viewing, because they were Catholic and visitation and viewing, but here we were in a national setting. But Robert F. Kennedy is on record saying, well, I just read that Mitford book, or that Mitford woman, and he strove to keep and convinced others in the White House that wanted to have a big, ostentatious state funeral. He convinced them to keep it very minimalist and quiet, which is... but despite that, she was a real advocate for cheap funerals and cremation. And that's had a gradual effect that's now accelerated, I would say, in the last 15 years or so. But it was a gradual effect that way. But it's something that if you talk to funeral directors, they're still very defensive and still trying to figure out how to react to the Mitford critique. As the 1970s and 1980s came on, academic fashion seemed to turn away from death to some extent, although it never entirely went away. And in this period, there started to be some serious concerns about the ethics of an anthropology or an archaeology that was so heavily featured white Westerners studying non-white, non-Westerners. And so one response was an internal self-critique that was based in theory, as well as a historical excavation of the disciplines complicit roles in violent episodes of colonialism, of racism, and nationalism. And another reaction was and still is to make the field more diverse in terms of who is doing the studying and who gets studied. And this has gradually meant that attention has turned to studying groups and movements in contemporary globalized societies, including the US. And this is where we enter the picture, although we're not all doing the US. So as a group of interdisciplinary researchers interested in the recent past and contemporary life, and while studies of dying, with the gerund, ing, have been a strong thread in the past 20 or 30 years. In fact, SAR has sponsored, I think, at least 3 seminars on issues around dying. And this is part of the sustained critique of Western medicine. There's been much less attention paid in recent scholarship, until I think right now, on the past participle, to those who have died. And so when we were trying to bring people together, that was a filter for us, that we weren't going to create another platform for people who are studying those who are in the process of dying and their families and medical people, but people who are interested in what happens post-mortem, for the grievers, for the people who care for the dead, and for the dead themselves. Let's see, just a couple more thoughts. So such attention on the dead, rather than dying, shifts our gaze back to death rituals, and to what's called disposition, or what we do with the corpse, to the relationship between the living and the dead, and to cosmological beliefs about what happens to us after we die. And I also don't think we can separate cultural currents from academic trends. They move in tandem, one influencing the other for sure. So people in the US, but it's also happening in the UK and Europe, are talking about death a lot more. I don't know about other places. That's part of my big question and my insecurities. I feel like I don't know enough about what's happening in Latin America and Africa and Asia around contemporary death. And I hope that we can make those connections and discoveries. But you may know that you probably remember the HBO show 6 Feet Under, which actually was a fairly accurate depiction, in my view, of a typical American funeral home, family-owned. May have helped open the doors to that. And some of you may be aware of Caitlin Dawdy's, no relation, although she did go to the University of Chicago as an undergraduate. Did you know that? Books, blogs, and a group called the Order of the Good Death. And what she calls her movement, and she's very media savvy, is a death-positive movement, just like we've had a sex-positive movement. And she is a millennial, and she gears her, I would say, most of her outreach to millennials. So there's interesting generational shifts going on that I'm still trying to figure out. And it means, for her, being death positive means everything from just being more open about talking about death, hosting death cafes, to doing a do-it-yourself funeral at home, which is actually legally quite permissible in almost every U.S. state if you follow a few guidelines. One of my own arguments is that 9/11 had a profound effect upon how Americans approach death, and I'm still struggling to articulate why. But since that time, there's been a proliferation. It just seems like the correspondence of changes that we're seeing in that event are hard to ignore. There's been a proliferation of forensics shows on television that often depict death and dead bodies in graphic detail, like we've never seen before in popular culture. And at the same time, enrollment in mortuary schools has soared in the last 10 or 15 years. And they've gone from worrying about the industry dying because nobody wanted to go into it, to having to actually turn people away from mortuary school, which for a long time didn't happen. And there's gender things going on. It's also very quickly moving from being majority male to majority female. And so, as to tie it up here, as one of the women I've interviewed has put it, we may be witnessing right now the death of denial in the U.S., at least for some groups. And I think you'll hear when we go around the group after Tamara speaks that modern society is so internally diverse that even that generalization I just made, or any of the generalizations I just made about trends in American death, by no means apply to everyone, and they never will. So perhaps a better characterization is that we're experiencing a period of diversification in death practices, and that's what we're here to study. So now I'd like to turn it over to to Tamara, and she's going to provide a little bit of an example of the kinds of things we're talking about.
No. I mean, I'm physically short. Yeah. Figure it myself. Thank you so much. Sorry, I have to log back into my laptop here. So maybe I'll just start talking while we're waiting for the technology to cooperate. So, is it there?
Good.
Oh, thanks.
I'm going to dim the lights a little.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I am an assistant professor of media studies and the director of gender and sexuality studies at the University of San Francisco, but I have a background in cultural anthropology, and so my own work is on digital afterlives and thinking about the forms of memorialization that are growing up around people's social media profiles and blogs and other electronic forms of communication. And part of what is really interesting about this seminar is that while there are a lot of different sort of academic groups all around the world who are studying death in a contemporary sense. So there's the Center for Death Studies at Bath in the UK. There are a lot of different death-related conferences, things like the Digital Death Day conferences, the Existential Terrains program in Stockholm, and at any sort of major academic conference in anthropology and communication and science and technology studies, religious studies, sociology, you will find a death panel, right? So there will always be like maybe one or two death panels, but they tend to be siloed. And there also tends to be a pretty stark division between people who are doing work on digital death or technology and death, and people who are thinking about the body and maybe new forms of treating the corpse through things like green burial or home funerals. So part of what we're doing in the seminar is kind of putting it all together in a way that I don't think has really been done before in a very comprehensive way, so it's pretty exciting. Okay, so maybe I'll just dive right into some examples of the ways that technology has sort of become intermingled with different kinds of death care practices, whether in digital spaces or at funerals that integrate a large number of different forms of technology, whether that means ways of preparing and caring for the corpse or disposing of the corpse, or things like even Skyping into a memorial service, something that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. So, a lot of these new things that are happening have much longer histories. So it might be interesting to take a look at much longer histories of communicating with the dead through different forms of technology. And media historians like Jeffrey Sconce and Molly McGarry have written about things like the spiritual telegraph, or this way of imagining a form of directly communicating with people who are not physically present because they're dead, through new technologies that allowed us to communicate with people who are not immediately present and embodied. And Sconce has a really interesting argument about how haunted media is this sort of way of imagining ways of communicating beyond the body, beyond presence. Victorian mourning photography, of course, is another sort of relationship between the sort of technological image and playing with this idea of, how do you capture people, the image of people mourning, so people wanting to remember that they are mourning and to be remembered for remembering, as Jeffrey Batchen, who's an art historian, put it. And also ways of sort of superimposing the dead back into images to show how the dead and the living are able to commingle, and you have this sort of objective, right, sort of photographic evidence of this commingling between the living and the dead, which was a very new thing in the 19th century. And there were other forms. With every sort of new form of technology, there were always all these ghost stories that would kind of form around the new technology that had just come into being. So, you hear about haunted radio waves or haunted television. And of course, with the rise of computing technologies, we now hear things about the possibility of a haunted computer, or at least a kind of afterlife that may persist through our digital belongings. And from the very beginning of the internet, you can find different forms of memorialization. You can find people sort of grieving through different online message boards that were very rudimentary at the time. Not many people were online in the very beginning. In the 1990s, it was not like the internet today, where essentially everybody has a smartphone and can access the internet at any time. And in the mid-1990s, you also have the growth of things like virtual cemeteries, which were really interesting because, while they were these sort of almost cartoony, in a way, online spaces that were, again, kind of rudimentary compared to the level of sophistication that we have in web technologies today, they contained elements that were left over from other forms of, physical cemeteries. So you can leave a candle for a small token. You can leave flowers. You can purchase other forms of gifts or items for the dead. And some of the early virtual cemeteries had these really interesting sort of sound effects as well. And so I remember one particular Polish virtual cemetery from the early 90s that had a creaking gate that would open, and rain and sort of lightning effects, and it just created this, this sense that you really were sort of entering a cemetery as you went from grave to grave. And people took these very seriously, and so even though obviously I'm poking a little bit of fun here because it's Steve Jobs, right, and it's a virtual memorial to Steve Jobs, the Apple guy,
who really did invent the internet.
Yeah, he invented the internet, that's right, as you would say. But for people, they had really strong affective or emotional connections to these virtual forms of memorialization. And this was a way of kind of bridging the material and the virtual or digital. The other thing that was different about these kinds of web memorials is that, unlike a gravestone, they're pretty interactive, and so people could leave messages and comments, and they could do that from anywhere in the world. And so, to visit a gravesite, you have to travel there, you have to physically go put the flowers in the grave. But with a virtual memorial, even if you're located halfway around the world, or are unable to travel to the grave itself, you can feel as though you are doing that work of mourning through the virtual cemetery. The other thing about it, though, is that they are public, in that anyone can access these virtual forms of memorialization. And so it's open to comments from people who don't know the dead at all, from strangers, from trolls, from people leaving spam messages and advertisers. And so that creates a sort of disturbance in the ways that people are used to thinking of the cemetery and the relationship with the gravesite. And so in general, many of us have probably seen different forms of memorialization that have popped up on social networking websites. So this is from a very famous glitch when Facebook accidentally started memorializing the profiles of people who were still alive, like me. And Mark Zuckerberg himself actually was memorialized in this way for a short period of time. But it just shows you, and so Facebook had this problem where, nobody could tell the difference between the living and the dead anymore. And so they created this, flower and sort of like remembering banner across the top in order to show people, oh, this is the profile of a dead person. Because, as people continue to interact with profiles, it's not always obvious who's living and who's dead. And that blurring can be a problem when, for advertisers, for Facebook as a company, when they're trying to figure out how many active users they have. And maybe they would like to not maintain the profiles of everybody after a while because it takes too much effort and server space now that they have 2 billion users worldwide. And so another thing that's sort of happening are all these tensions around how people's digital remains should be taken care of and who should do that work. And a lot of that has to do with legal questions over who actually has ownership over these profiles, because they're mostly always tied to corporate platforms like Facebook or Twitter or Gmail. And because of these sort of legal issues, there are a number of websites that have popped up, new companies that try to manage people's digital possessions after they die. And so the idea that you might have to, not just have a will that is going to, get your estate, bequeathed to your next of kin, and it's not just your plans for your own funeral and how you'd like to be buried, but also, what you want to happen to all of your digital stuff. And so this idea of end-of-life planning for the digital is a sort of new thing and a new problem that has emerged. So thinking about, the possibility of virtual funerals. So in games like Second Life, in World of Warcraft, which are very popular sort of online games that feature players from all around the world who are able to participate in real time. Sometimes for a character or for a person who's died in real life, they will have a funeral ceremony within the context of the game. And this is one example of a funeral for a character who has died. And obviously this is another way for people all over the world to potentially participate in real time in this event that they couldn't otherwise travel to. And it also creates a space for people who might not be close friends or family members of the person who died, but they're able to participate through the context of, the point of connection that they have, which is the virtual space or game. There's also a way that, materiality has really sort of intersected with different kinds of virtual memorials. And so in certain places, especially in China and Taiwan, it's very popular to leave paper goods for the dead. And in this case, you can also leave paper sort of electronics for the dead. And so you can leave your dead grandmother an iPhone or an iPad in addition to other sort of goods that might traditionally be left at the gravesite. Maybe I'll go back actually. We don't need to get to Caitlin Dawdy right away. Here. Oh right, I skipped over this one. That's better. Sorry. So another way that this sort of weird intermeshing of the material and the digital comes up is through QR codes on headstones, which isn't so common in the US, but actually in China it's very, very common. And there are many other places in South America. There's an entire graveyard, some Peru actually, that is every gravestone has a QR code on it. And these QR codes allow you to connect through a mobile device to a website that gives you more information about the dead. This is a way of sort of providing more context for the person, about the person who's buried. And another way that sort of new technologies are intermingling with the gravesite specifically is that in China there's a practice of having a sort of tomb sweeping day where people will go to the gravesites of their loved ones, they will clean it and leave flowers, and sometimes people cannot travel, and so they have cameras set up to live stream paying people to do the sweeping and the flower leaving for them, and they are able to live stream this through the Chinese social media app WeChat, which is their largest social media app. And so again, this is a way for people to sort of connect from very remote locations through technology and have that feeling of participation and attachment to materiality and to the body itself, to the corpse in its resting place. And so, as Shannon mentioned, Caitlin Dawdy and her project, which is the Order of the Good Death and the Death Salon, and the sort of general death positive movement. So we have people who are thinking about they're not using technology to remember the dead necessarily, but they are using things like YouTube. So Caitlin is very popular as a YouTube video maker, and that's sort of how she became a famous deaf person. And so they're very technologically savvy and will utilize new technologies, but they're actually about returning to what they envision as a kind of tradition. So we're actually about, returning to older modes of burial and getting away from the sort of corporatized forms of funerary practice that Shannon was talking about. So all of those things that Jessica Mitford, railed against in her book, they're trying to get, people in the U.S. to go back to another time when you could bury your dead loved ones at home, and where you would actually yourself wash the dead and care for them, instead of, outsourcing that labor to a corporate funeral home. And with that, there are also new sorts of technologies that go along with ways of actually disposing of the corpse. So this is sort of a more arty iteration, but this is a mushroom suit that allows you to decompose flesh, and it's very hip looking, kind of space suit-ish. There are also things like alkaline hydrolysis, which is a way of decomposing the body that turns the body to a kind of liquid that you can put down the drain. Right? And so there are new ways of sort of dealing with the flesh itself, or composting, that are moving away from things like embalming and the high cost of funerals and things like expensive coffins and all of those things. But on the other hand, we also have this turn towards things like virtual reality and sophisticated chatbots, like this is from Internomy, which is a startup that maybe isn't really so effective. But the idea is that you can eventually have a chatbot that you train to be just like you, so that when you die, it can continue to communicate with your loved ones. And so there's a sense that mourning maybe doesn't even have to actually happen at all. That you don't have to mourn the dead. You can kind of continue to interact with them forever. So another sort of version of this is in Japan. They've built a robot that looks like the deceased person, or they put a printed mask of the dead person on the robot, and then they have their communication patterns and their voice and their general habits are all recorded before their death. And then the idea is that this is sort of interactive and animated version of the death mask. And they only have the program lasts for 49 days, which is the traditional period of mourning in Japan. And so after that point, the robot dies. And so it's like this weird sort of liminal space where you use technology to sort of maybe, face the fact that your dead loved one is no more, and you have this kind of intermediary point. And so overall, I'd say that through our seminar and some of the things that have begun to emerge in our conversations is looking at changing expectations and how to care for the dead. And the question of who is actually charged with caring for both the physical and the digital remains of dead people, and how are people reconciling nostalgia for older modes of burial and memorialization with very sort of future-oriented threats like climate change, as well as these new technologies that are really changing the way that people think about death and the body and temporality. And what are the tensions between these different ways of treating the dead? So, how are different communities handling these issues, and what are the divisions, even within sort of some of the subgroups that we've been looking at? And another tension exists between consumerism and the idea of authenticity. And so we have groups that are turning away from the commercial funeral industry and are sort of becoming kinds of social movements that want to spread their message and change the way that people think about death and how they treat the dead. But then we also have the rise of all of these sort of corporate platforms that actually have total control over people's digital possessions after they die. We also have a recognition that people in general respond to ritual and that they're constantly remaking and reinterpreting and revising older practices. And so, people are sort of using an imagining of the past and kind of nostalgia in order to reframe where they want to go in the future. And so you have this sort of, tension between a, potentially, a nostalgia for the past, but then an optimism for the future going on. And we have new forms of rituals that combine secular practices with religious ones, the commercial with the sacred, or the digital with the physical, material, and embodied. So that's all I have for you.